In today's world, a discussion of the history of Africa is almost inseparable from the history of European colonialism. Now, this is for good reason, since colonialism has had a huge effect on Africa, one which is still being felt today and is impossible to ignore. But it also makes it easy to forget, or at least pay less attention to, the interesting history which came before the era of colonialism. Now, for a variety of reasons, that history can sometimes be difficult to illuminate. From a lack of written sources, especially when a culture doesn't have their own writing, to archaeological remains made of less durable materials, to archaeological sites which are difficult to get to, whether due to environment or politics. But if we really want to talk about a global history, in my case, a global Middle Ages, then we have to do our best with what we have. And what we have tells us that 1,000 years ago, there was a powerful kingdom in West Africa. A kingdom so sought after that merchants spent 2 months crossing the Sahara Desert in order to trade with them. A kingdom which, for Muslim geographers, was synonymous with gold. They called it Ghana. What is often called the Empire of Ghana is hard to pinpoint exactly on a map, but by and large it was located around what is today southern Mauritania and the southern part of Mali. Keep in mind, it has no connection to the modern country of Ghana. If you want to know why they chose that name after independence in 1957, you can Google it. From now on, whenever I talk about Ghana, know that I'm referring to the original. Today, much of the area of Ghana is either desert or Sahel. Sahel being dry plains with mostly acacia trees, which only gets growth during the short wet summer rains. It's hardly the kind of place where you'd expect to find an empire. But 1,000 years ago, things were different. You see, the Sahara and its frontiers have changed wildly over its history. 5,000 years ago, the Sahara was green, and it gradually became more dry over time. This peaked during a period from around 300 BC to 300 CE, sometimes called the Big Dry, where the desert stretched further south than it does today. After that, however, the area started to get more humid again, and the desert started to retreat north as grasslands took over. Compared to today, where the savanna region, known as the Sudan, comes to here, 1,000 years ago it would have stretched all the way up to about here, more or less. As you can see, Ghana fell into this region. Also, for the record, when I say Sudan and Sudanese in this video, I mean the Savannah region, not the modern countries south of Egypt which get their names from it. Anyway, this climatic situation made the region ripe for new settlement by various groups, including the Soninke, who would be the inhabitants and founders of Ghana, with large portions of the population moving around during parts of the year with herds of sheep and especially cattle. As for the agricultural side, the people dug wells and used the water to fill irrigation ditches, feeding their crops which mainly consisted of millet and sorghum. This agro-pastoralist lifestyle was at the basis of the emerging towns and kingdoms in the region, and was central to the lives of most people in Ghana. Another thing which helped Ghana and other regional states grow was trade. Long before gold was making its way north across the desert, trade was passing along between the Niger and Senegal river valleys, and south into the more forested regions near the coast. Copper, honey, salt, and iron were all passing through this region, and Ghana would have been thoroughly enmeshed into local trade networks by the time the trans-Saharan trade started to take off sometime around in the mid-700s. By the time we get our first Arab sources talking about Ghana at the end of the 8th and into the 9th centuries, they all note that it was already a powerful kingdom which dominated several other kings in the region, and scholars generally credit this windfall to their ability to make themselves central to this West Sudanese trade. The mention of Ghanaian dominance of its neighbors is also the reason why European scholars from the 19th century on started referring to it as the Empire of Ghana. However, at this point it's important that we stop and consider a few things. We don't have any sources directly from Ghana. Our written information about it comes from Islamic writers, none of whom ever went there. Their information is secondhand at best, and so they, and possibly even their sources, often explain concepts using terms that they and their audience will understand, but that doesn't necessarily reflect how non-Muslim Sudanese people would have understood it. This includes the nature of kingship and the relationship between the kings of Ghana and their sub-kings, including whether calling them sub-kings would even be appropriate. The European scholars who first called Ghana an empire attached certain ideas and assumptions to the use of that term, some of which have continued to be carried forth uncritically to the modern day and continue to color how some people think about Ghana. In all likelihood, it was probably a patchwork of relationships between various towns, tribes, and kingdoms to the king of Ghana. Some parts may have recognized the king's authority, maybe given him some tribute, while others may have been more directly administered, and these relationships were likely changing and being renegotiated all the time. There may have also been a religious aspect to it. We do get some hints about how this happened, though. Some sources talk about diplomatic relations, others about Ghana raiding its neighbors, and al-Bakri, writing in 1067 or 68 and widely considered the most reliable of our sources, mentions that the king kept the sons of several of the other kings of his domain at his court, a practice attested for other West African kingdoms, including the later Kingdom of Mali. Speaking of which, al-Bakri's description of the capital and court of Ghana is one of our best glimpses into the nature of this kingdom, and so I think it would be worthwhile to just quote it in full. Quote, "The city of Ghana consists of 2 towns situated on a plain. One of these towns, which is inhabited by Muslims, is large and possesses 12 mosques, in one of which they assemble for the Friday prayer. There are salaried imams and muezzins, as well as jurists and scholars. In the environs are wells with sweet water, from which they drink and with which they grow vegetables. The king's town is 6 miles distant from this one and bears the name of Al-Ghaba. Between these 2 towns there are continuous habitations. The houses of the inhabitants are of stone and acacia wood. The king has a palace and a number of domed dwellings, all surrounded with an enclosure like a city wall. In the king's town, and not far from his court of justice, is a mosque where Muslims who arrive at his court pray. Around the king's town are domed buildings and groves and thickets where the sorcerers of these people, men in charge of the religious cult, live. In them too are their idols and the tombs of their kings. These woods are guarded, and none may enter them and know what is there. In them also are the king's prisons. If somebody is imprisoned there, no news of him is ever heard. The king's interpreters, the officials in charge of his treasury, and the majority of his ministers are Muslims. Among the people who follow the king's religion, only he and his heir apparent, who is the son of his sister, may wear sewn clothes. All other people wear robes of cotton, silk, or brocade according to their means. All of them shave their beards, and women shave their heads. The king adorns himself like a woman, wearing necklaces round his neck and bracelets on his forearms, and he puts on a high cap decorated with gold and wrapped in a turban of fine cotton. He sits in audience or to hear grievances against officials in a domed pavilion, around which stand 10 horses covered with gold-embroidered materials. Behind the king stand 10 pages holding shields and swords decorated with gold, and on his right are the sons of the kings of his country, wearing splendid garments and their hair plaited with gold. The governor of the city sits on the ground before the king, and around him are ministers seated likewise. At the door of the pavilion are dogs of excellent pedigree, who hardly ever leave the palace where the king is, guarding him. Round their necks they wear collars of gold and silver, studded with a number of balls of the same metals. The audience is announced by the beating of a drum which they call duba, made from a long hollow log. When the people who profess the same religion as the king approach him, they fall on their knees and sprinkle dust on their heads, for this is their way of greeting him. As for the Muslims, they greet him only by clapping their hands. As you can no doubt tell, there's a lot of interesting information here. Although, if we're looking specifically at 1,000 years ago in the 1020s, as I've done in the rest of this series, al-Bakri might not reflect the situation 100%, but seeing as it's coming from only 40 years later, things likely would have been quite similar. The king of Ghana, who, by the way, al-Bakri and a few other sources say that Ghana was actually the royal title, was a man of high dignity, with much ritual and tradition elevating him, not to mention the lavish splendor of his court. Succession was also matrilineal, as al-Bakri alludes to in this passage, going from the king to the son of one of his sisters. In another passage, al-Bakri attributes this to the fact that the king can be more certain that his nephew is related to him than his own son, since he knows that his sister is the mother, but he can't be sure that he is his own son's father. Whether this is actually the reason for this practice is hard to know. Matrilineal succession is known amongst some other West African cultures, though it's not universal, and the Soninke today are largely patrilineal, so we don't know if this was common on all levels of society in Ghana or if it was unique to the king. Al-Bakri also gives us a glimpse into Ghanaian religion. It's not much, but we know that the king and likely most of the population weren't Muslims, despite there being a large and important Muslim population in the capital. We know from later sources that the kings of Ghana would convert to Islam sometime in the late 11th or early 12th century, but at this point, they still practiced their indigenous traditions, which, from the Muslim point of view, was seen as sorcery and the worship of idols, which, according to al-Bakri, they called dakur. We also get a further look at religion when he talks about royal funerals later on. He says that the king is buried with grave goods under a wooden dome alongside sacrificed servants or slaves, and the whole thing is then buried under a mound of earth. All the while, celebrations are held which include sacrifices and alcoholic beverages. But despite the religious differences, Muslims clearly play an important role in government and society. There was, after all, a large Muslim population with their own town. These were likely mostly North African, primarily Berber or Amazigh traders, with the establishment of a Muslim town separate from that of non-Muslims being a common practice at the time. The town of Kaukau, capital of another powerful Sudanese kingdom which competed with Ghana, was also said to have the same situation, with each town on either side of the Niger River. The Muslim town at Ghana's capital has long been identified with the archaeological ruins at Kumbi Saleh in Mauritania, but this connection is far from certain and there's still a great deal of debate, though in all likelihood the capital would have been somewhere around that area. The fact that Muslims held positions of administration and government is also quite interesting. In all likelihood, this came about when the kings of Ghana realized how effective Muslims were in these roles, in part due to their possession of a written language and habits of record-keeping as merchants. Having a class of foreign administrators was not at all uncommon in the past. Persians were famously employed for this purpose in India and Central Asia around this time as well. There may also be an aspect of trust involved as well. A king might not trust his subjects to serve him as loyally if they have local ties, power bases, and are involved in local disputes and feuds, which may create conflicts of interest. Outsiders, on the other hand, are tied, in theory, only to him. This is a similar logic as that behind the common practice of slave officials in the Islamic world and Jewish officials in Christian Europe, but that's just my own personal hypothesis. But of course, as I mentioned, the biggest interest for most Muslims in Ghana was trade, and especially trade in gold. There had been sporadic trade across the Sahara for centuries and periods of greater and lesser trade, but chemical analysis of Arab coins tells us that the trade in gold really started to get big between 750 and 800, and we get our first mention of Ghana around this time by the mathematician and astronomer Muhammad al-Fazari. There were several routes across the desert, following oases and wells, but one of the most popular started from Sijil Massa in modern Morocco. Ibn Halkal, writing in 988, was astounded by the wealth of the merchants and governors of that city, claiming that half the profits in all North Africa came from that district alone. From there, the merchants went south, arriving finally at the end of the desert in one of several wealthy, bustling trade cities, the most prominent of which in the 1020s would have been Oud Agost and Tadmeka. Oud Agost seems to have had a fluctuating relationship with Ghana. We sometimes hear that it had good relations with Ghana, and at other times that it dominated other kingdoms and interfered in local conflicts. But by sometime probably in the late 10th or early 11th century, the ruler of Oud Agost seems to have submitted to Ghana's king, though, again, exactly what that entails eludes us. Al-Bakri sees this as the cause for the Almoravids' eventual destruction of the city in around 1055, but we don't get any more clues than that. In any case, merchants then came to Ghana to purchase mainly gold, though they may have bought other things as well. Sources also make mention of honey from the south and the fibers of cotton trees. Slaves may have also been traded on occasion, but this was more common with the kingdom of Kanem further east, around Lake Chad, where they didn't have any gold. We hear of slaves in Ghana, but not really about them being purchased there. In exchange, North African merchants sold all manner of things, some of the most popular of which were horses, which were a great symbol of power in the Sudan and were also used in warfare, high-quality cloth, copper, and salt. Salt seems to have been one of the most valued trade commodities, especially rock salt mined from the desert, which was much easier to transport in bulk than sea salt from the coast. Oftentimes merchants would bring food and other products to trade for salt at mining settlements on their way across the desert, trading the salt for gold once they arrived in the Sudan. According to al-Bakri, the king of Ghana profited on trade through tariffs on goods entering and leaving the kingdom. As for gold, any nuggets heavier than an ounce were given to the king, and only dust could be possessed by anyone else. This may explain why gold dust was a common currency in Ouadagost, where it was made into ingots before being carried back across the desert. Ghana's gold was likely not mined in the kingdom itself, but came from the gold fields of Bambouk. According to al-Bakri again, it was purchased in the town of Hiaru by a group of Muslim Sudanese merchants, who then brought it to Ghana. It's interesting that he notes that these merchants were Muslims despite being Sudanese, that is, local sub-Saharan Africans, possibly Soninke. This is a separate group from the North African merchants whose journey ended in Ghana's capital, so that Ghana could control the gold trade. And al-Bakri even notes that they were surrounded by pagans who were, nonetheless, friendly and welcoming towards them. So, why were Muslims dominant in this trade too? Well, in all likelihood, these merchants were in closer, more regular contact with the Muslim North African traders, making them more likely to be in contact with Islam itself than most people in the Western Sudan. And on top of this, a shared religion could very well benefit traders and give those who did convert advantages, which over time led to those who weren't Muslims being pushed out or encouraged to convert themselves. There's also the fact, which Nehemiah Lefzian points out, that highly mobile merchants may have been less closely tied to local cultural traditions and therefore more receptive to a new religion. But we should also consider the possibility that there were other non-Muslim merchants which al-Bakri was simply unaware of. His sources likely never went beyond the capital after all. And that's pretty much all we know about Ghana 1,000 years ago. There are plenty of mostly older narratives that try to make certain claims based on assumptions and extrapolations, some of which are rooted in colonialist ideas. For example, Maurice de la Fosse made claims that the original kings of Ghana were white, assuming that black Africans couldn't have established a civilization on their own, and taking at face value Arab writings from the 1600s, which said that the first kings were Arabs descended from the Prophet Muhammad's son-in-law Ali, which in all likelihood was simply a way to tie the kingdom into Islamic history. Today's historians have no doubt that Ghana was founded by Sudanese peoples. Other claims are built on top of somewhat shaky grounds. Ghana has frequently been tied to the legendary kingdom of Wagadu from Soninke oral legend, and some have made assumptions about Ghana based on aspects of that legend. However, it's likely that parts of the stories about Wagadu come from various periods of history. Oral history is rarely static, and it can be shaped by the experiences and understandings of those who pass it down. Aspects in some versions of the Wagadu story might be based on historical Ghana, but others might originate later, or some earlier, maybe even coming from the kingdoms we know from archaeology to have existed in the region thousands of years earlier, before the Sahara's last maximum. It doesn't mean that the stories of Wagadu shouldn't be used to support historical arguments, but they should be used with more caution than some have done. There's also lots of discussion surrounding the end of Ghana, including about various invasions which are debated extensively as to whether they even happened. But seeing as that would have been well after the 1020s, I've decided not to go over it here. If you're interested though, do check out the sources I've listed in the description. Ghana is another one of those kingdoms which is often known by name, but far fewer know much about it beyond that. I hope that this video helps to rectify that a little bit. Doing the research on it certainly has for me. And I hope you've enjoyed the fruits of that research. As you can see, there's a reason why my videos take so long to make. As always, I thank you all very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.